So welcome everyone, and thank you all for joining us this evening for this important discussion, If Only We Dare, from the Harada story to ending Asian hate. This special presentation is in partnership with the Harada House Foundation and Museum of Riverside, stewards of the Harada House. My name is Katie Porter, and I'm Executive Director of Inlandia Institute, a literary and cultural arts nonprofit based in inland Southern California. But before we begin, Inlandia Institute respectfully acknowledges and recognizes our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, the Inlandia region is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, and we express our gratitude to them for allowing us the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. And now a few housekeeping notes. We would like you to know that if you need closed captioning, it will be available at the bottom of your screen momentarily. And so you may click the CC icon, or if you would like in the alternative to hide it, there is a small arrow to the right of that icon, and you may click hide subtitles. Also, this event is being recorded and it is live streamed to Inlandia's Facebook page if you would like to view it there. And also we will be hosting a Q&A at the end of this event. The chat function has been disabled for this evening, so please type any comments or questions into the Q&A box. So now at this time, I would like to hand it over to Robin Peterson, Director of the Museum of Riverside. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you, Katie. And it's my very great pleasure to invite or to welcome everyone here. I very sincerely thank panelists and audience members for participating this evening. This webinar was occasioned by the rise in crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders since the onset of the pandemic. And Katie, could you cue up the slides, please? The next slide, please. We would like to start with an introduction from the city manager of the city of Riverside, who regrets that he cannot be here in person.
Good evening. My name is Al Zelinka, City Manager for the City of Riverside. Thank you to the Harada House Foundation, the Inlandia Institute, and the Museum of Riverside for organizing If Only We Dare, from the Harada story to ending Asian hate. This panel comprised the Kimberly Harada, U.S. House of Representatives Congressman Mark Chicano, representing California District 41, David Inouye of the National Japanese American Citizens League, Dr. Carol Lee Tran, Professor of Psychiatry at UC Davis, Linda Liu, Impact Bay Area, and Curtis Takada Rooks of Loyola Marymount University. These panelists will provide beneficial perspectives on the topic of ending anti-Asian American Pacific Islander hate and hate crimes. Thank you for participating and contributing to more inclusive communities. In 2012, when I was considering coming to Riverside to work for the city, I was inspired by the city's inclusive community statement. The magnetic needle of the compass of Riverside was pointing in the direction of inclusion. That provided me with enough motivation to join this city team. Without question, we are living in a time of incredible environmental, social, and economic challenge. Challenge that is testing communities and countries, individuals, and organizations. Challenge is overcome through togetherness and cooperation. all of which must be based on shared understanding, shared vision, and shared responsibilities. The challenge of hatred towards others, the subject of this panel, is clearly unacceptable, as we are all part of communities in which diversity is inextricably linked to each and every fabric of place. And that fabric leads to the promise and potential of each community. I'm proud to serve as part of a community that embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion, and one that manifests this set of priorities within different policies. Riverside's inclusive community statement, for one, its anti-racist vision as another, and its resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis is a third. This is in addition to the City Council's recently adopted Envision Riverside 2025 strategic plan, which addresses the complete spectrum of social responsibility. As a city manager, I am also very proud of such important community assets, such as the National Historic Landmark Harada House, the Center for Social Justice and Civil Liberties, the Peace Walk on the Main Street Mall, the effort to save Old Chinatown and the Trujillo Adobe, the recognition of Pachapa Camp, and the newly established Civil Rights Institute of Inland Southern California. These are but a few community assets that I'm proud of. Thank you again to this panel and to the residents and leaders of Riverside and the Inland Empire region for your commitment to all of its diverse population and respect for their histories, as well as to your proactive stance in addressing racially motivated crime. Thank you very much and have a terrific evening.
So Katie, if we could return to the slides, there's a recent proclamation that was made by the new mayor of Riverside, which addresses specifically the issue of Asian American and Pacific Islander hate crime. And the fact that it happened is another indication of the severity and the extraordinary degree to which we're affected by this today. On the next slide, please. And of course, so severe has it become that new federal legislation has also been necessary. Next slide, please. So today we think of California as progressive, but in fact it has a long history of racist legislation, racial violence, and exclusionary property, social, and labor practices. The historic story in which this webinar is grounded is that of the Harada family of Riverside, California. When all they wanted was a safe home for their family, the Harada family found themselves forced to take on this exclusionary legislation in 1916. Next slide, please. Remarkably for the time, the Haradas secured a victory in 1918 in the ongoing process of moving past these realities. The Harada family's battle to keep their home was the first test in the US of the constitutionality of racist property in its immigration laws. But the family's triumph lasted only until World War II, when they and 120,000 other Asian immigrants and Americans of Japanese descent were incarcerated in the West. And where we are today demonstrates that the work is far from over. So we have a distinguished group this evening of 6 panelists who bring varying perspectives and experience. Each will speak for about 10 minutes on the topic of grappling with anti-Asian hate crimes recently on the rise, and we'll have a Q&A session, as Katie mentioned, after all the panelists have spoken. I'd like to start with the next slide, which introduces David Inouye. He's the CEO of the National Japanese American Citizens League. It has been for the last 4 years and has a social service background. Next slide, please. Mark Chicano is our congressman for the California District 41, House of Representatives. First openly gay person of color to be elected to the House. Next slide, please. Curtis Takata Rooks is an assistant professor at Loyola Marymount University, specifically interested in the cultural competency in community health and ethnic community development, focusing on Asian American multiracial identity. Next slide, please. Dr. Carol Lee Tran, assistant professor at UC Davis in the Department of Psychiatry, is herself a survivor of many kinds of persecution and the author of a number of books relating to this. Next slide, please. And this, in fact, is one of the more prominent books that Dr. Tran has written. Next slide, please. Kimberly Harada, a member of the Harada family, carries on the legacy of teaching that Jukichi Harada, her great-great-grandfather, began in this country. Next slide, please. And our last panelist, Linda Liu, is Executive Director of Impact Bay Area, which is a nonprofit that provides some of the practical skills that relate directly to the topic of this webinar. So I'd like to return to David Inuine now and ask him to present.
Thank you, Robin. Am I on? Yeah, all right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for hosting this. Thank you, Katie, also to the Inlandia Institute for hosting this wonderful program tonight to give us this opportunity to talk. I think what is really important in regard to our discussion today is really to understand that the racism that we're seeing right now isn't anything that's new. And that's made clear from the slides that Katie has shown, that the history goes back so far, that particularly with anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, that it manifested itself as early as the 1800s with the first Chinese immigrants who were working during the gold rush, working on the railroads. The idea of yellow peril, the idea of the unclean Asian as well, which we now see today, even as we hear people talking about the Kung flu and so on, that a lot of these themes have continued throughout our history. I think the other aspect is that there is a sort of continuity of our Asian history as well, that initially of course we had the Chinese immigration, we had the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and then once we decided we don't want the Chinese immigrants, let's bring in Japanese, Filipinos, Koreans, and of course we then fell out of favor, and ultimately in 1924 with essentially the cessation of any Asian immigration. And then, of course, as mentioned, we had the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. But it didn't start with that. It had already been in place for many years. The Harada House is a perfect example of that, where the alien land laws had been in existence years before they were actually forcibly then removed from their home during the incarceration. And this tragic thing is that a lot of those laws even still exist. I think it was just about a year ago that Florida finally removed the alien land laws that they had on their books up until that point. And when we look at the history, I think the other aspect we need to look at is the context of anti-Asian racism within the context of all racism that has happened in this country. That it's not just Asians that have been the target, but clearly, and we had the legacy of slavery before us, and then even throughout everything that I'd outlined previously, you had the Jim Crow laws, which were also targeting the Black community, and we had the land acknowledgement at the beginning of this program. We had the forcible removal, again, of Native people from the land. And I think the challenge is oftentimes that we sort of see ourselves different, that the different minority communities are perhaps are almost pitted against one another, and that's by design oftentimes in this racist structure. Basically you have Asians against Asians in history, and then you also had other groups against one another. You had the Chinese against the Irish, for example, in building the railroad even. And then similarly, you had basically Chinese laborers and others replacing the Black slavery that had existed for so many years. So you have all these sort of dynamics playing in play, but it is still that continuity of racism that has existed throughout our history. And then finally, I think the other thing about, for our own Asian community, is we have to recognize that we didn't really have an Asian American identity until like the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement. And even then, it really didn't take hold. I mean, you still had, JCL existed as obviously representing Japanese Americans. You had OCA with the Chinese Americans. And it really wasn't until the 1980s with the killing of Vincent Chin, where I feel like there was really a sort of a recognition that, you know, everyone else sees us the same. So why don't we actually begin to work together as an Asian American community? And even then, we had the challenges of diversity within our own Asian community. That's clearly the early perception of what was Asian American was largely Japanese, Chinese, Korean, the East Asian. But post 1965, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, we saw a huge change in what immigration to this country looked like, particularly from Asia. My own family is a perfect example of that. I'm actually half Chinese, half Japanese, and on the Chinese side of my family, my grandfather immigrated back in the 1920s as what was then called a paper son, essentially a euphemism for an illegal immigrant. He came under a false name because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, obviously, at the time. And on the other side, I'm actually newer Japanese immigration, where my father came in the 60s, post that Immigration Naturalization Act. But he came over here with a bachelor's degree, had already worked for several years in Japan, representing a very different experience of immigration in this country. Also, an experience as an Asian American where he did not experience the deep-seated racism that had existed pre-civil rights legislation in those mid-1960s. Also coming to this country with the education, the means to not have to supposedly pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everything. He was already coming in here, already pretty well pulled up. So that's also created challenges within the Asian American community. And I think what's interesting, particularly with this past year of COVID, is that we are seeing a lot of Asians who historically have not really understood this concept of racism suddenly having that light bulb turn on as they're seeing, yes, I could be targeted by this deep-seated racism that has existed. And I think that's sort of changing a lot of sort of the community's perception of racism for a lot of Asian Americans and Asians who perhaps have not naturalized yet in particular. I think that where this has also played out, you had mentioned the passage of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And that was a great victory, but it also sort of demonstrates some of the challenges we face in confronting racism in this country. Now, when that COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act passed, it passed with overwhelming majorities and bipartisan support. What's very interesting is that in getting that passed, we actually were able to work into that, the Jabara Hire No Hate Act, which was a anti-hate crimes legislation that we've been trying to get passed for years now. And this is something that has been out there and was basically languishing because it did not have that strong bipartisan support. But suddenly we, for some reason, were able to get that critical mass of people to support the anti-Asian hate, where they weren't willing to support it when it was necessarily a broader anti-hate act, which even supports more groups of people, like Black, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQ hate crimes, which have all existed. And that's the reality. All of these have always existed, but it's sort of the sudden recognition of the need to do something. And the important part of that is we were able to use the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act to bring that along. But at the same time, there is that sort of disappointment on my part that it took that to be able to pass Jabara Hire to bring about the broader reforms. And then finally, as we look at what can we do to confront anti-Asian hate? Obviously, passage of that legislation is key. It calls on the federal government, the Justice Department to do a lot of different things, particularly with tracking hate crimes and trying to identify some of the root causes. One thing I feel is easy to overlook in that I particularly like is there is also a provision in there giving flexibility in sentencing for more restorative justice opportunities that can include community and victim education for the perpetrators of hate crimes. And this is where organizations like those of us here tonight, like JACL, like the Harada House, are important in providing those educational opportunities about the impacts of racism and xenophobia on our communities. And of course, the challenge is that education only takes us so far, but what we also need to be doing is addressing some of the stereotypes that are also in place, and that's where education is also important. But it's also this type of collaboration with perhaps non-Asian focus groups like the Museum of Riverside, the Inlandia Institute, which tonight are hopefully helping us reach a broader audience than we would within our own Asian community. And then finally, I just want to note that we need broader community support to stand up and support victims. And I know Dr. Tran is probably going to talk a little bit about the mental health toll that our community has really been feeling over this past year. And with that, I think I have exhausted my 10 minutes, so I will hand things back over to you, Robin.
Thank you, David and Ewer, for those comments. We've got Congressman Mark Chicano up next.
Thank you, Robin, and good to see you, David, and all the panelists here. And my thanks to the Inlandia Institute, the Riverside Museum for bringing this panel together and for producing this program. The idea that we need to in order to confront the present and build the future, we have to acknowledge and understand where we came from and how we came to be. The often paraphrased quote from William Faulkner, "The past is not the past, really. It's really, we're really weighted down with it. And even if we don't, and it's terrible. It's a terrible situation when we don't even know that we're weighted down by it. So look, I want to get some, in the time I have, I want to just sort of mention some very specific ways in which racism was embedded and is still embedded in our legal system. And the Hate Crime Act that I had the pleasure of and the privilege of being a part of putting through the Congress and being at the signing ceremony with President Biden a few weeks ago is one of the steps to try and undo or atone for or fix or reckon with what Congress has done historically. Among the very first laws that Congress passed, in the very first Congress in 1790, is the Naturalization Act of 1790. It's one of the first laws that Congress passes. And what does this law do? It says who can become a naturalized citizen of the United States. If you weren't born here and you didn't pre-exist when the country is created, we're talking about the actual creation of the United States of America. There are those who want to put forward a creation story of America, which is very, very whitewashed, literally, that does not include the flaws, as somehow pointing out the flaws in our story somehow invalidates the whole story. That does not have to be true, but nevertheless, the land of the land of the free and home of the brave. One of the very first laws it passes is a law which says that only white persons, I actually use the word white in that sentence in the law, Only white persons of good moral character can become naturalized citizens. And of course, in those days, it meant men. And it wouldn't be until much later that even there's a court case which clarifies that Japanese immigrants are not white people and therefore are also not eligible for citizenship. That case happens, I don't know, 80 years after that. I'm looking at my notes and trying to see what is that law. Oh yes. Actually, I didn't write it down, but nevertheless, that is always, so if you think about it, all the way up until 1943, Asian people who immigrate here have no pathway to citizenship. We're talking right now about the struggle of a pathway for citizenship for about 10, 11 million people who are in a country undocumented right now. And we have a very sympathetic group we call dreamers, those young people that were brought by their parents as little children or as infants or as minors to this country. And you know, if you grew up in this country from the time you're 1 year old, 2 year old, 5 years old, you're pretty much acculturated as an American. And it seems awfully cruel to most people to say, let's send those people back to where they came from. Actually, we're sending these young people back to cultures and countries that they don't even know, and they may not even really speak the language and know the culture of where they came from. And so that many Americans see that as a cruel fate. But understand that for more than 150 years, that was the fate of Asian immigrants in this country. They were excluded from the possibility of naturalization. And it wasn't until 1898, in a case called United States v. Wong King Ark, that it was established that a person of Chinese ancestry who's born in the United States is protected by the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment and has birthright citizenship. So for 30, 40 years after the Civil War is fought, it's not clear that Asian immigrants and Asian children of Asian immigrants have a stable right to citizenship. So it's not until 1943 that Chinese Americans can naturalize, and it wouldn't be until 1952 until other categories of Asians could naturalize. And this is all very significant because what is Harada House about? Harada House, the story of Harada House is about a judge saying, well, Jukichi Harada could buy real property in the name of his children. And he does this, in this case, he fights in 1916. And it happens in the context of tremendous racism in our society, tremendous racism in our government. In 1917, there's an Asiatic Barred Zone, Asiatic Barred Zone Act of 1917, which says that Japanese and Chinese can't immigrate to the United States. There is tremendous anti-Asian sentiment that is occurring. Now, I mean, I could talk on and on and on. I'm very passionate about this subject, but let me just get to, I think, a key point, which is that, this sort of, David did a good job of talking about Asian American identity kind of coming to a head in the 80s with the Vincent Chin incident, but then it kind of sort of recedes. And I'm skipping over the whole Japanese American internment experience, which my parents went through, all my grandparents went through, which was a culmination of a buildup of anti-Asian sentiment that happened in the early 20th century. But post-war, we have communism to fight, we have allies to sort of embrace. There's just a new mood that's sort of politically brewing across the country. America is exceptional in this time period, but we see how important leadership is and who our leaders are. They set a tremendous tone. And out of political expediency and convenience, in an attempt to shift blame or to run away from blame, blame gets assigned to people of Asia. There's tremendous investment in President Trump in trying to get the COVID-19 virus pinned on China. And he does it in a very irresponsible way, communicates in a very irresponsible way that boomerangs on Asian people of whatever background, of whatever ethnicity they come from, but boomerangs on Asian populations in the United States. There's no way you can separate that kind of irresponsible communication with the consequences of rising violence against Asian people who look Asian in the United States. Not everybody yields to those violent impulses, but when you have a leader of the United States validating for that minority of people to act out those violent impulses, that's the consequences of bad leadership. So we can have all the laws we can on the books, but if we don't pay attention to the kind of leaders, if we don't check the kinds of ideologies out there which give rise to this, we won't be able to really fully combat racism. And I think this is a very big wake-up call, We're not through this moment that we've been awakened to yet. But with that, I think I'll stop because I'll just keep going. So I want other voices to be heard here today, but I think that's the most salient thing that I can contribute to this discussion now.
Thanks so much, Congressman Chicano. And with that, we'll move quickly to Dr. Curtis Takata-Rooks for his comments.
Thank you. At the beginning, I want to apologize. My Wi-Fi is a little unstable, but I hope I'll be able to make it through without too many glitches. I first want to thank the Harada House Foundation and family, the Riverside County Museum, the Inlandia Institute for this opportunity to share with you tonight. And with my 10 minutes, I want to sort of address the notion of combating racism and talk about ethnic studies. And one of the prompts that we were given as panelists from the organized committee was on ethnic studies. And we were asked, is there value in ethnic studies? Can toleration be taught? And finally, they mused, in spite of the fact that schools, many media outlets, and outward social dialogue since the civil rights era of the 1960s has taught that racism creates great social harm, we still face it. They asked, why do children still grow up learning to fear and revile those different from themselves? Well, I'd like to begin by addressing the last question first. So why do children still grow up learning to fear and revile those different from themselves? Whenever I'm confronted by questions like this one, I'm reminded of these lyrics from Stephen Sondheim's musical Into the Woods. Careful what you say, children will listen. Careful what you do, children will see. Asian American activist and journalist Grace Lee Boggs said, history is not the past. It is the stories we tell about the past. How we tell these stories triumphantly or self-critically, metaphysically or dialectically, has a lot to do with whether we cut short or advance our evolution as human beings. I'm 64 years old. When I grew up, there was no ethnic studies. And in school, we rarely heard stories about my families and my communities. Simply put, as people of color, our stories were not valued. To learn about my history, I learned from elders and great storytellers. Today, as an ethnic studies professor, I'd like to think that I'm one of those story finders, those storytellers, and those story explainers. Ethnic studies acknowledges not only what stories we tell ourselves, but proposes explanations for and under the stories told and those stories left untold. For the purposes of tonight, I will focus on only 3 of the things that ethnic studies does that I believe brings value. It focuses on the contributions and tribulations of those left out of the traditional telling of stories in our educational system. Looking at the elementary school level, it celebrates and the triumphs and catalogs the hardships of people of color and their communities in the making of America. But ethnic studies at this level is much more sophisticated than sheroes and holidays. It recognizes that children are capable of complex understandings of success and failure, of complex understanding of changes in beliefs and actions, and circumstances and forces that drove those past choices. Ethnic study also asserts that when children are given stories about the contributions of all people in science and technology, philosophy, expressive forms such as music, poetry, literature, we can then begin to attack the stereotyped understanding of the other. Secondly, ethnic studies acknowledges and defines systemic and structural discrimination as a tool of power, both its acquisition and maintenance. Systemic and structural discrimination is discrimination embedded in the laws, policies, and legal patterns in practice, such that discrimination continues to occur without regard or need for individuals to believe in targeted group discrimination. Simply following the rules will produce the differentiated outcomes. The California alien land laws that you've heard about provide a good historical example when aliens ineligible for citizenship cannot own land in California. This targeted immigrant Asians were the only racialized immigrant community in the US ineligible for naturalized citizenship. Thus, county clerks, following the law, without regard for their own personal beliefs, could not issue title to immigrant Japanese or other Asians. Japanese and other Asian immigrants and their communities were deprived of property ownership, hindering their ability to gain economic stability and independence, as well as accumulation of wealth. Now, housing covenants and mortgage redlining served this purpose in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The third thing that ethnic studies does is that it emphasizes acts of agency on the part of folks of color who face fears of discrimination. Again, let's take the case of the alien land laws. Immigrant Japanese, within the letter of the law, put land ownership in the names of their birth citizen children. The Harada family are a living example of such agency. They did to stand up for their right of home ownership within the existing laws, and they used the legal system to secure those rights in the face of neighborhood resistance. Acts of agency, like that of the Harada family, served to challenge and change the society in which we live. Research captures analysis of acts of agencies are used to remove barriers that keep us from moving toward a fundamental foundational core value of equality. Yet, even with our desire to educate ourselves out of racism, ethnic studies continues to be met with resistance and retribution. Can I turn to song's lyrics? Careful what you say, children will listen. Careful what you do, children will see. What children are hearing and seeing today is an effort to delegitimize and vilify ethnic studies using the newest monster under the bed, critical race theory, a central tenet of ethnic studies. Seek to embed their criticisms of the law, legislatures across the country and at the federal level even, through willful ignorance, or worse yet, a fundamental understanding of the power of truth, are leading an assault against critical race theory, claiming that it promotes divisiveness and using this critique to inflame fear among everyday people. So what is critical race theory? Well, in its most simple form, critical race theory argues that race is a salient and integral variable in understanding the distribution of social, political, cultural, economic, and educational resources in our country. It does not hold that individuals are evil or even bad, nor does critical race theory assert that the US is bad. Critical race theory adheres to one of our nation's most fundamental core values, that all persons are created equal. So when success in our society does not reflect that value, and we see identifiable groups left out of success, then we should and need to determine what is intervening or mitigating the enactment of that core value of equality. Critical race theory advances that race and our uses of race offers powerful insight into a major barrier that keeps us as the United States from living our values. Ethnic studies advances also that each of us is a part of the storytelling and that each voice has currency. Ethnic studies seeks to elevate those previously obscured and silenced voices for everyone, not just BIPOC persons. It advocates that the privileged outsider objective view is one of the perspectives. Tells us that as critical thinkers, we should gather as many as possible, analyze them critically, and then make up our minds. And so I end as I began with Grace Lee Boggs. History is not the past. It is the stories we tell about it. How we tell stories, triumphantly or selfishly, metaphysically or dialectically, has a lot to do with whether we cut short or advance evolution as human beings. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you tonight.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rooks. And with that, we move quickly to Dr. Carol Lee Tran.
Thank you, Robin. Good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be with you. I would like to begin by dedicating my talk and giving a deep bow to the 120,000 Japanese Americans who were forcibly removed from their homes during World War II. I also want to honor the brave Japanese American soldiers who served and died for our country while our government imprisoned their family members. It is difficult to describe the profound harm and the multiple levels of trauma and intergenerational trauma that's been inflicted on the Japanese American community as a result of their internment. In spite of the maltreatment and injustices, it is truly remarkable to see how this community has maintained its dignity, grace, and resilience. The history of the Harada family and house is an example of such resilience. Unfortunately, our nation is very slow to learn from its past mistakes because Asian hate is rearing its head again. Over a year ago, many of us in the Asian American community expressed concern and outrage when then President Trump used racist rhetoric to weaponize COVID-19 against our community. In May of 2020, our wonderful panelists, David Inouye, and many other organizations sponsored a national webinar entitled Yellow Peril in COVID-19 Time. At this webinar, I and two other psychologists, Dr. Satsuki Ina and Dr. Gordon Nagayama Hall, all sounded the alarm that Asians were being targeted and attacked. But our warnings fell on deaf ears. Recent studies show a direct correlation between the 150% rise in hate incidents against the AAPI community and Trump's racist rhetoric on COVID-19. His venom has resulted in more than 6,600 hate incidents being inflicted on Asian Americans. This figure is a gross underestimate, since only 30% of Asian Americans report hate incidents to the police. It is absolutely tragic and infuriating that it took the massacre of 6 Asian women in Atlanta for the nation to finally wake up and recognize the gravity of the problem. On March 16th, when I saw on the news that these women were killed, I was devastated and triggered. Flashbacks of multiple hate incidents that I had experienced came flooding back. Like the time when I was shopping at Costco and a man walked up to me, pointed his finger in my face and yelled, "You need to stay 10 feet away from me, not 6 feet. You disgusting bat-eating bee. You should be shipped back to where you came from." By the way, the word bee stands for female dog. I will not repeat that word, but you know what I mean. Then there was the other time when I was at a New York subway station with my then 15-year-old daughter, who stood frozen in fear as she heard an irate but well-dressed man spew the most demeaning racial slurs at her mother as he reached for my throat and gestured that he was going to strangle me. Both incidents happened within the last 2 years. The perpetrators were white middle-aged men, and there were multiple bystanders who saw everything, but nobody bothered to step in to help. I've shared my stories to illustrate what the AAPI community is going through and why we're tired, we're angry, vigilant, and afraid. It is exhausting and traumatizing to see your people being hunted down and attacked every single time. Stereotypes of Asians as being the perpetual foreigner and a national threat to the US makes us target for hate incidents. Also, being labeled as the model minority pits us against other communities of color. It also reinforces the assumption that we have no problems and we don't need help or resources. These assumptions make us feel invisible. My tolerance when visibility ended in 2017, when I found out that migrant children were being separated from their parents at the borders. I identified with these kids and remembered when I was separated from my family during my escape by boat out of Vietnam as a refugee. I will never forget the deep terror and feelings of hopelessness and helplessness that I felt on that day. Witnessing the atrocities being inflicted on the families at the borders by the Trump administration compelled me to act. This resulted in the making of my short documentary entitled My Vietnam War Story and my book, The Gifts of Adversity. In it, I write about my escape out of Vietnam and being a survivor of pre-sexual abuse. I marvel at how my initial desire to help others have also provided me with some gifts. Writing the book has liberated me from carrying the secret, helped me to take another step forward on my journey of healing, and allowed me to transform my adversities into something that helps others. I hope that you'll have an opportunity to read my book and to discover that it is not only about trauma, but also about hope, strength, and resilience. I would like to end by asking you to join me in acknowledging our nation's complicated history. Change requires our humble acknowledgement of our present and our past. America has had a long history of dehumanizing and oppressing various groups. This was done to women and people of color to deny them of the right to vote, to Indigenous Native Americans to strip them of their land, to African Americans who were enslaved and denied every right, even after the emancipation, to Japanese Americans who were interned, to interracial couples whose marriages were not legal until 1967, to the LGBTQ community to deny them of the right to choose who they love, marry, and have children with. Because all of this is a part of our history, we must dare to expose and speak out against all policies and actions that support hate, bigotry, oppression, and racism. This disease of hate and racism is so malignant, pervasive, and insidious that it takes all of us to combat it. If we witness someone being hurt or harassed, let's dare to be an ally, do something, say something, intervene. Let's dare to join efforts to stop Asian hate, stop police violence, free children from detention centers, fight systemic racism, resist efforts to curtail our right to vote. The list goes on and on. We have so much work to do. I believe that at the end of the day, it is our humanity, our activism, and our basic acts of kindness towards one another that can be the most powerful medicine to heal our deepest wounds and to make our world a better place. Thank you for tuning in and for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tran. And now our next panelist, Kimberly Harada.
Thank you, Robin, and thank you to those of you who have supported and allowed this webinar to occur. Following in the footsteps of my great-grandfather, Jukichi Harada, I am a teacher. We just wrapped up the academic school year today. It's been a long one. I teach here in Southern California and have taught first, third, and fourth grade. My master's degree is in curriculum and instruction, and in completing my program, I found my passion in changing and critiquing our current curricula, including our social studies curriculum. I have loved researching and teaching my students about historical empathy, the teaching of past events, and the reasons and circumstances that cause reactions and events to happen in history. I grew up here in Southern California in a predominantly upper middle class white neighborhood. And growing up, I never felt different or felt like I was treated differently than any of my classmates, a privilege afforded to me by my great-grandfather and grandfather and those that have come before me. It wasn't until sixth grade when on December 7th, a sixth grade teacher asked if we knew the significance of the date. One of my classmates stood up, pointed his finger at me and said, "It's when your people bombed us." I remember being shocked and stunned as I had never experienced something like this. I remember replying probably in a quick-witted, or so I thought, way of saying I was a fourth-generation American. I think in a lot of ways, the racism that I have faced or that I was exposed to was that I was supposed to take these comments as compliments. And I think that oftentimes racist remarks against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is supposed to offer some kind of comedic relief. The size of our eyes is funny and we're smart. So what's so wrong with pointing that out? When I entered my teaching program, looking at the way that the world was shaped socially encouraged me to pursue elementary education. I believe that alongside parents and guardians of students, teachers are the first look that children see at what being human and operating in this world looks like. It becomes our job to instruct on what respect looks like. And in elementary education, I have the opportunity to impact students at a young age so that they can have the chance to change and use this knowledge to impact others for the rest of their lives. And when you're 6, that's a long road ahead. If hate can be taught, tolerance can be too. But I think we need to dig deeper than tolerance. I use empathy to guide my instruction throughout the year. It becomes a base for everything that I do and how I structure my classroom management. At the start of each year, I begin with a literature unit that revolves around empathy. We start with The Sneetches by Dr. Seuss, and it springboards us into a discussion about what makes us human. It allows us to answer tough questions, like what makes us different? And in a class discussion, we talk about if different is bad or if it means that it's less than. And if not, what instances is different treatment necessary? It starts a discussion about equity versus equality. And it helps to garnish our classroom community as not all learners are the same. It becomes the crux of our classroom. In years past, I have had the opportunity to teach blind or visually impaired students, students with diabetes, students with all kinds of special needs. Learning and interacting with each other looks different, but it is not always a bad thing. It means that we get what we need to access our learning. After we read this niches, we read a book called Stand in My Shoes by Dr. Bob Sorensen. It offers an explicit dictionary definition as to what empathy is and gives real life examples so that students can not only identify with the main character, but can practically see and apply it to their real lives. We talk about what empathy is, and we talk about how it means that we put each other in our shoes. And if we feel one way about something like getting interrupted or being talked over, why would we put that on somebody else? We read Pete the Cat and the New Guy by James and Kimberly Dean, which allows us to discuss what we do when our new classmates or when our new friends look and do different things than we do and how we interact with them. After we read this, we read This Is Me, a story of who we are and where we came from by Jamie Lee Curtis. This is probably one of my favorite stories that we read in our unit. It gives way to a discussion about immigration and immigrating to a new place. We talk about the things and traditions that are important to us. It offers a place to begin discussing our family and personal histories. I love reading this story because it gives an opportunity for me to share my own personal family history and the struggle and strife that my family has gone through in order to find a place at the table. Finally, we read Last Stop on Market Street by Matt de la Pena. This book is important, especially for where I am currently teaching. It gives way to a conversation about privilege and how others don't live like we do. How sometimes people have to take a bus or need food from soup kitchens and have the opportunity to get to see the world in a different way. These discussions pave the way for how my students respond to one another and respond to me. It gives them a reason to be mindful of how they treat each other. Talking about empathy gives a more tangible behavior expectation than just saying that they need to be respectful of one another. At the end of the day, even as adults, defining respect is tricky. We usually give examples and not a definition, and oftentimes we will use the word respect in defining its attributes. I find myself often explaining respect by using the golden rule. We treat others the way that we want to be treated, which at its heart is empathy. My classroom rules include that everyone in our classroom's voices are heard and respected. And we talk about what this looks like. When students blurt or talk over one another, which is bound to happen, we talk about how they feel when they are interrupted. I think as adults, we oftentimes discount what children perceive and how they understand the world around them. And so when we have these conversations, it allows my students to ask the big questions and to answer them as well. My students have come up with answers like, when I'm interrupted, it makes me feel small. And in that, we talk about and decide that if no one likes that feeling, then it's wrong to make someone feel that way too. From my perspective, I remind students that I'm human and that I have squishy insides that can be squashed by their words and actions as well. It gives them a reason to respect me in the classroom, more than just that I'm older than them or that I know more than them. This year, we focused on intent and impact. My first graders and I spent the year setting differentiating between what the intent was behind an action and who it impacted. My hope is that they become adults who ask those questions before they act. My classes over the years have endured a lot. A shooting in our community in a nearby high school when we had to respond with a hard lockdown. Our community was impacted by the Route 91 massacre, and this year by a global pandemic. And students will ask the big questions that we as adults will ask too. Why do bad things happen? Why does hate exist? I take the opportunity to say this, and what I will leave you now with. Every day, every choice, every breath is an opportunity for you to choose who you are. And I hope that each time you get to choose, that you will choose kindness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly Harada. Very thoughtful. And our final panelist is Linda Liu.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on this very, I feel like I've learned a lot and gotten a lot of inspiration and books that I would like to read from this panel so far. So thank you for having me. I am Linda Liu from Impact Bay Area. Impact Bay Area is a violence prevention organization that has been teaching violence prevention and self-defense programs for 30-something years. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we have been offering classes for Asian Pacific Islander Americans who are really concerned about race-based harassment and violence. And we have seen floods and floods of people who have wanted to take this training because they are dealing with a lot of fear and anxiety around this issue. But I have to say that we've also seen so many people reach out to us with a huge demand for our bystander intervention classes, for our interrupting oppression classes, because there are so many people out there that do want to be allies and are seeking skills and practice so that they can be in solidarity with us. So that has also been really inspiring for me as a person who has been sort of holding a lot of the anxiety and fear that people in my own community are feeling. I'm also really feeling the solidarity from others. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that so that others can feel that too and know that people are out there looking for opportunities to help and to be active allies. You know, and I think that when we offer programs that give folks skills and practice in using the skills to deal with anti-Asian harassment or violence, I like to remind people that just like we prepare for situations with self-defense or other skills, we're preparing in advance for a situation where we might need to use those skills. But it's important to prepare not just when our own community is being attacked. Many of the previous panelists talked about the various and long-standing history of racial violence in this country. And so I believe very much that these skills can prepare us to also be better allies to other communities. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the skills that we teach in our trainings that can help us. And one of the things that I want to say is that a lot of people come to it thinking like, well, I don't know what I would do. And I really believe that many people already have so many tools available to you that can be used to handle these situations. But oftentimes we don't have access to those tools because we are experiencing a huge rush of adrenaline. We're having that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. Or we're experiencing some emotional overwhelm that can come with being targeted for racist or any other kind of attack, particularly if we have past experiences where trauma comes up. These can be sort of like really intense situations that cause us to sort of forget the safety resources that we have available to us and forget that we have these tools. And so I'm actually just going to introduce a couple tools and invite everyone to try them out because we believe that practicing is the best way to ensure that you will be able to access these tools when you are adrenalized, when you are scared. And the first tool that I want to talk about is just a simple breathing technique that can help us manage adrenaline. So I'm going to invite everyone just to take a big breath in. And then we're going to exhale for 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's do it 2 more times. Breathing in and exhaling for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Last time, breathing in and exhale 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to do one more. I know I love teaching this one first because it helps me feel more calm and less adrenalized when I am giving a training. But for this one, if you are standing up or if you're sitting down, if it's possible to put your feet on the floor, just pay attention to where your feet are touching the ground. if you're standing or if you're sitting in a way that allows you to sort of like shift your weight around a little bit in your feet, just try to notice where you put more weight in your feet, maybe the toes, maybe the heels, balls of your feet. If you're sitting in a chair, you have more to work with. So pay attention to where your legs are or your back are touching, whatever it is that you're sitting on. And just take a moment to really pay attention to where your body is making contact with the furniture or the floor or whatever it is that is supporting you. This sort of grounding exercise can help us come back into the present moment and avoid being swept away by adrenaline or emotion, and literally be a reminder that we are standing on solid ground. We are being supported. These are really simple techniques, and they may sound really simple, but they're really effective in high adrenaline moments. And what I like about these two particular techniques is that you can do them without anybody noticing that you're doing anything, okay? So like having this intense adrenaline response in a scary situation is, it's normal, it's human, we all get that. And we can practice some techniques that can help us move our way out of that adrenaline response and make choices about how we want to react to these situations. The other way to really like ensure that you're able to access your safety tools and training under adrenaline in these intense moments is to practice under adrenaline. So of course, we invite you to take a class with Impact Bay Area, but I want to talk about a couple other skills that you can use in these situations. So the first one I want to talk about, the very first self-defense skill, is intuition. So take a moment and just think about a time that you were scared and try to identify in your body where you feel those feelings. So there's usually a physical sensation that is what we call intuition feelings, right? So your intuition happens when parts of your brain are receiving information about things that are happening around you. They've perhaps detected a potential threat, and then they are using your body to warn you that something might be wrong. So some people get like a tightness in the throat. Some people feel their heart pounding. We often talk about intuition as a gut feeling because people feel either like a fluttering sensation or a heaviness or dropping in the stomach. And it's really important to pay attention to those intuition feelings. If you feel like you're in an unsafe situation, you can certainly make the choice to advocate for your community and tell a person that what they're doing is wrong, but you also get to make the choice that you're going to prioritize your safety and exit that situation, right? So listening to your intuition is really important, and it feels really basic, but at the same time, so many of us have all this training that teaches us that we should ignore our intuition, right? Like somebody is coming towards me, they're really creeping me out, their behavior or their words are suggesting to me that they might be a threat, but oh, I should give them the benefit of the doubt. It would be really rude if I just got up from my seat and moved, right? So we have all this training that teaches us to prioritize politeness sometimes, or proper social behavior over our own safety. And I feel like for me as an Asian American woman, I have all of this like sort of added cultural training that tells me like, oh, don't make a fuss, like don't draw attention to yourself, when, for very good reasons, right? Many of our parents, grandparents, ancestors have succeeded in many aspects of life by using this invisibility defense mechanism, but it's not effective in all situations, right? So we want to be able to access other tools. And the last thing I really want to talk about is that one thing that we consider a really important piece of self-defense that you don't see in a traditional martial arts or self-defense class is this concept of calling help, of talking about what happens to you after it happens, right? So Dr. Tran talked a lot about trauma, right? And the trauma from these incidents, the harm that is caused by being the target of a racially violent attack or even witnessing it, some of that harm comes from that moment, but lots and lots of that harm comes afterwards, right? From not taking care of yourself, from holding it in. When you don't talk to anybody about it, you sort of like open the door up in your own mind to self-blame or to, question like, well, nobody said anything, so I guess I was in the wrong. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe it's something about me. Maybe they're right. So it's really important. And I would love to invite everyone right now just to take a moment, just a brief moment, and think about if you witnessed an anti-Asian attack, if you were the target of harassment, who in your life would you tell? Who would you talk to about it? Right? So many, I know, have so much like training from my own family, like there's so much like tradition about like not talking about unpleasant things, but there are other people in my life that are supportive and great listeners. And so I invite everyone just to like, just like you would train in self-defense skills in case you were in a situation like that, this is part of that. Think about if something were to happen to you, who do you trust that you could talk to? Friend, therapist, coworker, neighbor. Just think about that in advance because it's a really important part of taking care of yourself. Okay. And of course, there are lots and lots of resources out there that will be shared, I think, with the group about ways that you can take care of yourself. That most people by now are familiar with the reporting websites and places that you can find resources if something like this happens to you, if you're really stressing or worried about anti-Asian violence. So last thing I want to say is just to invite folks. We are doing one of our Facing Race-Based Harassment for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders trainings. It's a Zoom training. It's online on June 26th. And so if you are interested in learning and practicing more skills to be able to stand up for yourself and others, please join us. impactbayarea.org is our website. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda Liu. I don't believe I see any questions in the Q&A, but I wonder if any of the panelists has any questions for other panelists. It's been a diversity of opinions shared and viewpoints and perspectives. We do have, as Linda mentioned, some resources that will be dropped into the chat for our participants to access. They give a range of information about bystander intervention training and how to talk to your children and resources such as that. And I wonder if Katie, if you could bring the slides up again. A lot of it has to do with learning about the history of all the different, the diverse populations that we live among. And that is part of what the ethnic studies effort is about. Next slide, please. Documenting and reporting is important. This may be against the instincts of some, but it's proven very helpful to get out your phone and record what you witness. Next slide, please. So the Harada House campaign is underway. We're working very hard to rehabilitate the Harada House so that it can be opened as a site for civil rights discourse in Riverside and beyond. It's a National Historic Landmark that has not been accessible yet, but we're working hard on it and hope that you will take part in that. And one more slide, please. Just a couple more slides. One of the Harada family in 1927. Chikichi Harada is the man standing in the center right, and Ken Harada, his wife, in the center are the one. Chikichi Harada is the one who pursued the legislative or the legal action against the family. And the house in its current state stands in the picture on the right. Everything we're doing right now is aimed at getting that house open. And if we have, let's see, I think we have a couple more questions in the Q&A. There is a question from Tanya Pastor. What techniques can teachers use to encourage other educators and administrators to devote more class time to the topics we discussed today? Sometimes teachers and administrators are reluctant to break away from their existing curriculum and views. And are there members of the panel who would like to address that question? Perhaps Kimberly or Curtis? Curtis, you're muted.
We seem to be having some technical problems because now our panelists can't unmute.
It looks like Curtis.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Well, at the university level, it's a tad bit easier, though we still have challenges in terms of being able to devote more time and energy to battles over what our general education requirements are in the Jesuit institutions. Our core curriculum have been extremely terse and difficult at times to continue to have the voices of people of color in particular elevated, as opposed to diversity, meaning diversity of all thought, diversity of anything. As well as that, when you get to the nitty gritty, it's about power, holds power, and the lack of desire to relinquish power, and the ability of truth to unseat power. So, and the parents that they're answering to oftentimes are some of the biggest resistors. So I would think that you'd have to get a coalition of parents to work with administrators. I don't think as an individual. I mean, if you can do that, I know that's what we did in our schools when my daughter was coming up through the systems.
Kimberly, do you want to add to that? Struggling with the unmute. There you go.
Perfect. Hi, sorry. I think in the elementary education, a lot of times the way that I perhaps skirt around the curricula, I go from a more standards-based perspective. So a lot of times I'll use standards like further in the upper grades, it lends itself a little bit easier, but we'll talk about perspectives, multiple perspectives in a passage or whatever. And so I'll use literature that corresponds with that. The big push right now is for students to be encouraged to participate in socio-emotional learning. And so a lot of this empathy that I use is my basis for my SEL lessons. And a lot of times what I'll do is mine is just classroom management. And if I'm encouraging other people, I had recently talked to a coworker who was having trouble in her classroom with bullying. And she was like, do you know anything that I could do about this? And that was a really good gateway for me to just be like, hey, I use this. In fourth grade, our social studies standards actually ask that we, and this works well as far as teaching students about heavy topics like World War II or Japanese American internment specifically. The fourth grade social studies standards actually ask that we identify and analyze the effects of World War II on California history specifically. So that's an amazing gateway to just start off by saying, here it is, let's talk about this. We also talk a lot about democracy in our social studies curricula as well. So if I think the long way to answer, or the short way to answer this question, I think is sometimes the TEs don't have it all. And your teacher editions aren't going to be packed with the juicy discussions that we get to have. And sometimes it means skirting around those rules by looking at what the standards are asking. And at the end of the day, our Common Core state standards and what we want from our kids in our classrooms is that they are at the very least critical thinkers. And so I focus more on what can I do to push students out of my classroom who are empowered and employable. And this means interacting with people in the workplace that look different from them. So let's dive into that and what it looks like. So break the rules.
Other comments?
I actually see this from go ahead, Mark.
Robin, I just participated. I was trying to look through my calendar to find it, but there is a website, and maybe we can get this out to people at some point, but where prominent Asian American performers are reading from books children's books. So there's a project, and it's based out of San Diego. And actually, I think it's in connection with African-American voices. I'm wondering if Curtis might know about this project, but I actually introduced the project with Judy Chu on a national virtual feed. And but here's the point: there are materials out there that are written for various grade levels, which are good starting points. And I think the other thing to realize is that I'll say one more thing about teachers and classrooms. I was a teacher for 24 years before I became a member of Congress. Often the most powerful way to engage students and to make that argument to your administrator is you have to engage students in their personal stories and finding ways to tap into what they can explore with their own family. And that's often a gateway and a window into teaching history, is to do work with their personal stories. At the secondary level, there are ways to get involved as a teacher in curriculum design. You have to every school district has a little bit of a different process, but sometimes it's at the department level, and even designing courses. Or when you're looking at the courses you have, how it is you're going to be a part of those discussions, which actually design what the curriculum is. And again, you're going to be in different situations given how a particular school system is set up and how much teachers are empowered. But that's also your role as a teacher, is to try to find ways to empower yourself and to work with others to reshape the curriculum, what's taught.
Thank you. David, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I actually see this from the perspective of a parent of two children. I have a 6th grader and a 3rd grader now. And for the 6th grader in particular, last year, I know that her instructor had used Journey to Topaz as one of the books that she had all the students read. So it is integrating those types of books. And then also on her summer reading list, there were several other books. For example, George Takei's graphic novel, which is actually a fantastic resource. And it's very accessible. My 3rd grader actually has read it several times. So it's one of those things where there are it looks like you're getting a copy of that. So good. Yeah, so it is, I think, making these resources available to students. And it doesn't necessarily have to be part of the required curriculum either. Like that reading list that my daughter got before she entered middle school had probably 25 books on it, and George's book being one of those. But it was several different diverse authors. And what was interesting the other day, actually just a couple of days ago, I did a book event with the Shibatani siblings. They have a new book just came out. Obviously not something that's so much for academic purposes, but important in the way that for Asian American and other diverse youth to see characters that mirror themselves in books. When I was growing up, I would have never imagined seeing a book that had a Japanese name in it, and there in the Shib Sibs book, one of the characters is named Mika, which happens to be the name of my daughter as well. So there's just so many resources out there available to teachers that you can integrate into your lesson that I don't feel like you need to be going out of your way anymore to try and bring in these diverse perspectives or stories.
Just to add on to that as well, the new wave of children's literature is a lot more non-traditional looks at things. So non-traditional families, non-traditional people. We're tending away from just one singular voice being heard. I think, like the saying, history belongs to the victors. If we think about that and how that relates to what literature we're perceiving. And I had a professor in university who said that children's literature is the window to society and what we deem as acceptable in society. And so now we're seeing a lot of things like Eyes That Kiss in the Corners is a popular children's book now that references what Asian American eyes look like. And so we're seeing a lot more of our voices and our identity inside of literature, and hopefully getting pushed more now towards inside of framework or inside of curricula as well.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions that we would hopefully will be able to access?
I wanted to add that I really feel like on a national level and a state level, I think all citizens, we need to push for our politicians to help get more diverse history. I mean, we have states that are shutting down and refusing to allow people to learn critical race theory. I mean, you know, we can't let that happen. As a nation, we need to push, push back those efforts to do that. So I think it's fine to kind of put the responsibility on teachers and have them, do all these things. But I think politically, we also have to get the momentum going in states and on a national level.
Absolutely.
And actually at the federal level, there is legislation now to promote the teaching of Asian American stories. Grace Meng has a bill out there to promote Asian American studies teaching. There's also a bill to promote African American history instruction. And there's also the Japanese American Confinement Education Act, which also is to promote the teaching of Japanese American history. But ultimately, education is a local activity, or at least at the K through 12 level. So it is also important to do those efforts locally for parents to lead that. And also, actually, we're seeing students do the leadership now as well. I know there's a group, I'm here in Washington, D.C., over in Northern Virginia that has a group of students that has really pushed their school to bring in Asian American studies into the curriculum there.
David, you make a good point. There's going Grace is trying to making sure the confinement sites and the education fund are fully funded, that we not only get these bills through, but that the appropriations completely funds them. I do acknowledge that there are states where they're trying to ban all sorts of attempts to teach a critical view of American history. The question is, how practically will these laws be enforced really in the classroom? The politicians at the state level in various states, I mean, we have a limited ability to, in the short term, to address those laws. They'll probably be challenged in the courts, but in the meantime, it is really going to fall on the choices of teachers and principals to stand up for teaching what needs to be taught in classrooms. And so that doesn't excuse the responsibility of those of us who are in elected positions, but frankly, in these states where they're enacting these laws, the battle is going to be played out by brave teachers who are really who have always had that role. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for those people like Kimberly who are doing the jobs they're doing. In California, you have a better environment, but this is a long moment that we're in. And it's not as if the battle is going to be completely fought by those who are in elected office. Everybody's going to have to look at not being a bystander.
We have a commenter who says she's listening from Tennessee and reporting that they're passing restrictive legislation on everything.
Well, I mentioned the notion of agency, and so certainly those acts of agency have to occur at all the different levels, from the legislative at the federal, state, local, et cetera. But I also don't want us to feel paralyzed that we as individuals and members of families and communities can't do something as well. Some of us will be called to lead the petition that forces the school district to consider our things. Others will bring those books into our own homes and read them with their own children. As grandparents, will read them to our children, as uncles and aunties and all those sorts of things. Because again, Sondheim's not a prophetic person in this necessarily, but children do see what you say. I mean, they listen to what you say and they see what you do. And if all you do, and if we don't sort of take charge of the things that we can control, right? What I read to my child before she goes to sleep, what I share, what I give as gifts to my nephews and nieces, and family friends, that makes a huge difference and opens those doors for conversations, as well as write stuff yourself. I know that when I was coming through, there were very few books on mixed race that were there for my daughter. So we wrote our own to tell those stories, and that's important.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank all of the panelists again very much, and for everyone bearing with our glitches in the technical side of things. It's been a very interesting and diverse set of viewpoints, and on behalf of the Museum of Riverside and the Harada House Foundation and Inlandia Foundation, or Inlandia Institute, I believe Katie wants to come back on again. I thank everyone warmly for participating and being on the panel.
Robin, it's the Conscious Kid Library.
Oh, got it. Okay, thank you.
ConsciousKid.org, and it's the Conscious Kid Library where these resources are.
Thank you. Katie, did you want to make a closing remark?
I do, thank you. And I would like to echo Robin's sentiments about thank you all for bearing with the technical glitches. It seemed that tonight was our night for those, but we love technology. And I really appreciate all of our panelists, and you were fantastic. If anyone in the audience has questions that did not get asked, I do encourage you to please email them to me, and I will make sure they get to the panelists. And my email address is cati.porter@inlandiainstitute.org. I also am going to do a quick share screen. We did drop a resource sheet into the chat, but if you do not have access to that for some reason, again, please email and I will be more than happy to send this out. And there are a lot of resources that were compiled specifically for this event tonight. So I encourage you to avail yourself of them. So with that, I say final thanks to Robin and Mark and David and Curtis and Kimberly and Carol Lee and Linda, and also to Judy Lee for assisting with our Q&A. And we hope we hope you leave this with some changed perspectives and hopefully some new ideas about how to prevent these hate crimes and violence from happening in the future. So have a wonderful night and thank you.